We start now. Yeah. Hello and welcome to the 7th webinar of the T20 Summit Season 2020. This webinar is co-hosted by the T20 Saudi Arabia and CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, Canada. My name is Jitendra Roy Chaudhary, and I'm the coordinator for Task Force 7 G20 support for SDGs and development cooperation. I'll be leading through the webinar today and will be keeping the time. If you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box below. We'll do our best to answer them. I would like to invite Dr. Sami Al-Suwailam, Task Force 7 Lead Co-Chair and Acting Director General, Islamic Research and Training Institute, Islamic Development Bank, to take the floor. Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jitendra. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Fahad, for the extraordinary management and coordination for the T20 for this year. I'm obviously biased because we are all in the same country, but I think I am, to some extent at least, I would say this is an objective assessment. Welcome to our esteemed participants and panelists to this webinar on the T20 Task Force number 7. If you allow me for a few minutes, I will just go through quickly the task force. This is the task force number 7 on G20 support for sustainable development goals and development cooperation. The priorities of the task force includes incentivizing the private sector to support the sustainable development goals, enhancing G20 strategies for development cooperation with least developing countries, improving the G20's capacity to deliver and monitor the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, supporting regional development initiatives for sustainable and inclusive growth, improving G20 support for gender equality and economic empowerment for women, recognizing the importance of universal health care, and making urban areas livable and sustainable for all. And as you can see, or as you can figure out, these are very ambitious objectives and priorities. And obviously, it wouldn't be an easy job to achieve these objectives, but at least I would say the members of the task force and the authors of the policy briefs, they did their best to contribute toward these objectives. The task force has myself as a co-chair, but we also have Elizabeth Sidropoulos, the Chief Executive of South African Institute of International Affairs. We have Dr. Bilay Bigasho. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your good name. Director General, the Sustainable Development Goals Center for Africa. We have Dr. Jennifer Jivara, Rising Talent Postdoctoral Fellow, Dublin City University, and Associate Researcher in the CIPPEC. And I have to figure out what is CIPPEC, which is Center for the Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth. Is that true, Dr. Jennifer? So why the G from growth is missing?
Because it's translated to English. It's in Spanish because the center is in Argentina, CPEC. We hosted the T20 2 years ago.
All right. And we have Dina Bennett, Global Lead, Enterprise Development, Women's Economic Imperative Founder, International Consultant for Entrepreneurship and Enterprise. It has been a very fruitful and productive journey. And I have to say that the co-chairs did a marvelous job in coordinating, evaluating the policy briefs, and making this effort a success. The task force members, they participated in several events for the G20, for the T20. I will not go over these. The T20 statements also, the task force contributed to the universal healthcare coverage statement and early childhood development and sustainable development goals. The task force also proposed themes for the overall T20, and these proposed themes, we are not saying they were approved, so Dr. Fahad will not get upset with me. These were just proposed. One is to redesign the financial system to support and magnify the impact of the Sustainable Development Goals. Another major theme is to adopt a holistic approach regarding the motivation to implement the SDGs, including common social values and shared faith-based principles, and embrace comprehensive and universal healthcare coverage. The task force received 60 abstracts that were submitted last year. It were reviewed, screened, evaluated, and 10 abstracts were accepted. That doesn't mean the other abstracts were not good. They were, the majority of these abstracts were good, but we have to select the best among the good. And we end up with 10 policy briefs. 51 authors contributed to these 10 policy briefs from 43 institutions. As we said, these policy briefs include topics like health, education, redesign of the financial system, science and technology, and including also the role of non-state actors in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The policy briefs were highly informative and high quality, and we hope the outcomes of this task force would contribute to an impactful and useful and helpful progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much. Up to you, Jitendra.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, for introducing the task force webinar and setting the stage by summarizing our journey over the past year. And now we are delighted to welcome the President of Center for International Governance Innovation, Rohinton P. Medhora, to give the opening keynote address for this webinar. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin by thanking and in fact endorsing the work of the Saudi T20 Secretariat for managing a research and policy process during such a turbulent year, and for organizing this set of discussions. I've had the privilege of joining several of these and have learned so much, and I'm hugely impressed with the way this is all unfolding, and so I quite look forward to the discussion today as well. I would, in my opening 15 or 20 minutes, start where perhaps G20 leaders and decision makers more generally do not have the luxury of starting, which is to ask ourselves, what is development? And the fact is, the core notion, or at least in the early years of development, was very much to focus on growth in incomes and to see income as a representation of larger aspects of welfare. And we've progressed much beyond that. And so broader and broader definitions or views of development have included such items as health and nutrition, education, housing. Then there's a second large set that one might add, which is about the biophysical environment we live in, but also the capabilities and opportunities that are offered to people around the world to grow in its fullest sense. And then, of course, we have questions of distribution, of justice, and the quality of institutions that we create to govern our lives. And the progress from the MDGs to the SDGs in some ways reflects this transition. I think the MDGs were, in my view correctly, critiqued for being somewhat minimalistic and focusing on basic needs, as we used to call it in the development world several decades ago. And so the SDGs, which of course therefore are much more numerous, in fact recognize the wholeness of the development enterprise and bring in concepts that are difficult certainly to measure, difficult to achieve, but important to understand and to value nonetheless. And so from this, I guess I derive two observations. One is that if you think of the SDGs as being about welfare more broadly and about the human condition, if you will, then these are not just about developing countries. In fact, the SDGs are an overarching global framework, emphasis on global. And the reason I say that is if there's one lesson that we can derive from the last decade or so, it is that not paying attention to some of the factors that make up the SDGs in developed countries has huge consequences for everyone. And so questions about institutions, the environment, distribution are just as important in developed countries as in developing countries. And if we see a fraying of the global consensus, and if we see a certain skepticism of globalization in many so-called advanced parts of the world, it is probably because we made the mistake of seeing the SDGs as being about development and developing countries and poverty alleviation only. The second point I'd make is that these SDGs hang together, and that was implicit in the way they were created. It's implicit in the way the introduction was made by Dr. Sami this morning for me here in Canada. But the fact is that implies a certain sense of social cohesion. It implies a certain faith in public or collective action. And more broadly, it implies that there's global cooperation and that we have the global institutions that we require to get there. We forget that MDG 8 was actually about global partnerships. And that's the one we probably talked about the least. When we said that countries had mostly achieved the MDGs, we probably meant the other 5 and certainly the first 4. I'd make the same point about the SDGs, that the SDGs will only hang together if we pay attention to 16 and 17, which is to say questions of peace, justice, and strong institutions, and questions of partnerships. This is what brings the G20 and the T20 community together, to understand how these points interlink. And as I said at the beginning, this is not something necessarily in the heat of a moment or a summit that leaders necessarily have the luxury of thinking about. Of course, we do all of this recognizing that the primary motor to achieve SDGs is still national action, not international action. Therefore, I'd make my opening point as being that the SDGs are truly universal. They probably define the G20 agenda as a whole, and that they're not necessarily a subset of the G20 agenda. In practice, what we know about the G20 is that it was created in crisis and probably functions best in a crisis. One thing that the G20 doesn't get enough credit for in its early years when it was created was the dog that didn't bark, which is to say, the G20 at the time in 2007, 8, 9 averted what could have been a horrendous trade crisis. And so by avoiding that kind of beggar thy neighbor policies, we kept the engine of growth going and we kept the engine of cooperation going. That's frayed since then, but I think it's worth noting that crises averted are at least as important as crises resolved. Of course, the G20, through its creation at the leaders level, recognized the importance of global cooperation, and the ones of constant has been its focus on international financial systems and domestic financial systems, and the progress of discussions in global finance from the Financial Stability Forum to the Financial Stability Board. And the next step might well be to turn the FSB into the fourth leg, if you will, of the stool to create a fourth institution that's treaty-based and that recognizes the importance, as does this task force, of finance as both a stabilizing mechanism, but also a driver of growth and development. It's probably fair to say that the G20 has been preoccupied with crisis, and when things kind of stabilize, it becomes much more difficult to make progress on issues that we know are important, but might not be urgent. And so I'm struck by the variety of issues that this task force has covered. Health and universal health insurance, education, including distance learning and connectivity, early childhood development, pre-education, if you will, the importance of science, technology, and innovation, sustainability and infrastructure, the importance of faith, something that certainly in the economics community we don't recognize enough as a driver of social cohesion and ultimately of society, private investment and credit, and private philanthropy in developing countries. And so what I'd now like to do is turn to the crisis we are in currently and reflect on what the G20 is likely to do and what it might be doing. This crisis, like every crisis, offers opportunity, and in its own perverse way, it has given us an opportunity to think about what we can do to make the world a better place. And so the phrase "to build back better" has 2 or 3 components to it: to build back fairer, to build back greener, and certainly to build back more prosperous, because indeed prosperity is the key to achieving many of the things we desire. It is a fact that the economic and other gains of the last 10 or 20 years are likely to be wiped out in many parts of the world by the COVID crisis. It is a fact, therefore, that the gains that we were so proud of during the MDG era coming into the SDG era might be reversed. And so the ambition that we set for ourselves by creating 17 goals rather than 8 and making them that much more granular and ambitious is in fact in doubt. What is the G20 likely to do, and what has it done already? A classic G20 issue, one that's in its genes, of course, as I said a few minutes ago, is finance. And so debt relief is going to be at the center of G20 discussions. So far, the action on debt relief has been tepid, to put it mildly. The debt relief package has been limited in every way and does not reflect the kind of growth that we need in budget constraints and in thinking about macroeconomics to allow countries to tide over the crisis. In many countries, traditional budget constraints have simply been busted. That's the case in most of Western Europe. It's the case in the US. It's the case in my country, in Canada, where what we thought were appropriate limits for debts and deficits have gone out the window because governments have said that they do whatever it takes to keep the country whole, to keep societies whole, and to keep people reasonably secure. That kind of thinking has not extended into many parts of the world, in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. And at the center of that is going to have to be some kind of rethink on debt relief. Whether that goes as far as thinking through new SDR issues or not, we don't know. So far, again, the signs have not been good. But at least this crisis has reopened that whole discussion, and that holds some promise for the future as well. Second, trade and securing supply chains is going to be a feature, or has been, in G20 discussions, and should be. But I do think, and I'll come back to this point next, that rethinking trade more broadly than simply thinking of them as redesigning supply chains is in order. And it's, again, the kind of issue for which the inclusive G20 was created. All the right players are at the table, virtual table this year, and can think through this issue. And the third feature I'd point out about global cooperation in which the G20 has been central is COVAX. The question of understanding that an important, not only, but an important part of the way forward in this COVID crisis is to not just have a vaccine, but have one that's more or less universally available, and to not let issues like price and logistics and intellectual property and so on get in the way. And so COVAX has been a very thin silver lining in what has otherwise been a quite challenging landscape when it comes to global cooperation. What can we think about that goes beyond these issues and create a bit of a long-term agenda that does justice to the work of this task force and the T20? Because it is our job, in the absence of a permanent secretariat for the G20, to exactly highlight these issues. I'd make 4 or 5 points here by way of winding down my remarks. The first point I'd make is the crisis has highlighted the importance of the virtual world. The reason we're having this meeting today is because many of us in this world are connected and can log into Zoom, but many, many more people cannot. And so questions of the digital divide, questions of cybersecurity, questions of the ability to work from home in this kind of crisis, questions of the future of work itself, which is going to be upon us anyway because of digitization and robotization, have come to the fore. And in fact, the content of digital platforms has also become a feature of the public discourse in many countries. The G20 has been mostly silent on this large and challenging and timely digital governance agenda. I think it has now gone from being simply important to being important and urgent. And I do hope that the G20 has a serious set of discussions to make progress on many of these issues. Second, and related to that, is norms around technology. Now, on this, both the G7 and the G20 through the OECD have been discussing for a couple of years. But the widespread use of apps to track COVID has brought once again the question of the surveillance society in which we find ourselves tumbling. There is a nexus of issues, a trade-off, if you will, between the public health benefits or other public benefits of technologies, privacy, personal security, and human rights. And in times of crisis, it is understandable that the trade-off tilts one way. But when you get out of a crisis, we equally have to understand that we cannot simply ratchet up the surveillance. Having some sort of global norm, the way we did many decades ago around human rights, might be in order, and in fact might now be overdue. The third observation I'd make goes back to my point about COVAX, which I think in and of itself is helpful. Perhaps at the virtual summit, some important members that have not signed on to COVAX in the G20 might sign on. But at the end of the day, COVAX is basically a vaccine subsidization and vaccine distribution scheme. If you now think beyond that to some of the issues that COVID has raised, this is very much a G20 agenda. I would highlight, for example, greater cooperation in science, the way we have already and have had for many decades in international agriculture. Revisiting norms around intellectual property and TRIPS, and more broadly to understand that in instances where technology has large positive or negative spillovers, it is indeed a question for global cooperation and not simply for private or national action. The fourth point I'd make is about the future, not just of the organizations at the center of these issues, the WTO and the WHO, but more broadly, the future of global trade and global health. Both of these domains have changed in many ways in recent years, nothing just to do with COVID. Supply chains, the digital economy, e-commerce, the rise of pandemics and their rapid spread because of globalization. These were issues that were live before the COVID pandemic. They're much more live now. And so the governance system we want around them and the type of institution or family of institutions we want is going to be important. And I do hope that the G20 begins that discussion in a serious way. And last and not least, COVID has highlighted the importance of social safety nets. The redesign of social safety nets is mostly a national issue, but I think it's healthy for the G20 as a collection of national leaders to come together, as they often do, and exchange best practice, to challenge each other on what can and should be done, and in the process create both an international but also national social safety net. And so some ideas that were considered out of the box some years ago, universal basic income comes to mind. Indeed, different kinds of universal health insurance come to mind, have now entered the public discourse in a mainstream way. I think this is entirely healthy. And the signal that the G20 leaders send in encouraging this kind of discussion, and indeed progress and action, will be important. And so we have, as a community in the T20, our work cut out for us. There's lots of interesting ideas that I know we've been launching through this webinar series, and I do hope many of them are taken up. And if they're not, our job is to continue to hammer away at them in years to come as well. So I will stop there and look very much forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your thought-provoking address. Two key points highlighted by you about the implications of the education and health crisis caused by COVID-19 and the emphasis on the usage of science and technology in research and innovation provide us with a segue for today's panels. These twin themes resonate across our two panels in today's webinar. It gives me great pleasure to hand over the mic to our moderator for the first panel discussion of the day on the critical role of health and education in achieving sustainable development goals, moderated by Laura Homke, a global health consultant. Laura has extensive experience of working in global health, including field assignments in Africa. Laura has also been a valued peer reviewer of our task force policy briefs on health. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. What a great keynote that kind of leads to our first discussion this morning. My name is Laura Homke. I'm a professor of health policy and management at the University of North Carolina, Gilling School of Global Health. As Dr. Medora said, I mean, coming together in this way is unique and unprecedented. The keynote reminded me of the Winston Churchill quote, "Never waste a good crisis." And I think our first discussion this morning on really how we can maximize what we've learned through COVID and build back better in health and education really fits. We have four great panelists this morning with us. I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into sort of the meat of the topic, which is really looking at SDG 3, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages in a very inclusive way, and also SDG 4, which again, reminding us, is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities. So with that, I'll ask Dr. Jennifer Guevara to introduce herself. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this webinar and collect the fruits of all the collective effort we've done this year. My name is Jennifer Guevara, and during 2020, I have been co-chairing this task force. I am a research fellow at Dublin City University's Early Childhood Research Center, and I am associate researcher at CPEC in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work on early childhood policies and systems, mostly in South America, but lately I have also been able to dive in European systems as well. And I would like to thank you, Jitendra, for all the work you've done in putting together this webinar, as well as the amazing coordination over the last year. Thank you, Dr. Samis, and thank you, Laura, and thank you, fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'd love to ask Dr. Yonette Thomas also to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. It's morning here in the United States. I'm Dr. Yonette Thomas. I'm an epidemiologist, actually more specifically a social epidemiologist. I've led the policy brief on global public goods for health and have been involved in a number of these webinars. And Jitendra, I laud you, my esteemed colleague, and I hope I didn't give you kittens for not getting on soon enough. I've been long in the field of social epidemiology and urban health research, and I led He was the chief epidemiologist at the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Health here in the US. And I will stop there because my bio will go on and on. Thank you. I'm happy to be here among the distinguished colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yonette. Yes, I think all of our panelists have long bios with a lot of interesting background, and we'll learn more about them as we move on. Now, my pleasure is to ask Dr. Dina Bennett to introduce herself.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, Dinah Bennett here. And again, I'll echo the thanks of everyone to Dr. Sami and to Jitendra. It's been a wonderful year being a co-chair of Task Force 7. I too am delighted to be here, and it's a pleasure to join the panel. I'm the Global Lead for Enterprise Development for the Women's Economic Imperative, an organisation whose provenance stems from a UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. One of the co-chairs of this now, our CEO. My role is very much that of a facilitator supporting enterprise development, both at policy and practice level globally. And the work ranges from working with governments, developing gender-sensitive policy, to capacity building individuals and organisations to support enterprise in its widest sense. It's great to be with you all.
Thank you very much, Dinah. Last but not least, it's my pleasure to ask Dr. Heidi Alaskari to introduce herself. And you're there in person, which is great. It makes, I think, the whole panel feel like we're connected to what's happening there. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Laura. And yes, welcome to Saudi Arabia. We wish we had everybody here and we were able to host you. But in the absence of the ability to do so, I'd like to take this opportunity to say good afternoon from Riyadh. And welcome to the panel. It is an honor to be with you. My name is Heidi Alaskari. I am a speech language pathologist traditionally by training, and I've worn many, many hats here in the Middle East. I've worked on everything from strategy to policy development to rolling out programs, but specifically in my area of expertise, which is diversity and inclusion and equity across the board of education, research, policy development, employment, you name it. I also have had the honor of serving as the Task Force 6 lead co-chair here at T20 Saudi Arabia. And that task force was on the economy, education, employment in the digital age and the impact of the digital age on those areas. So it has been an extremely educational process looking at this very high level and supporting that whole process, looking at the policy briefs developed across these topical areas. Finally, I am a visiting research fellow for the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and the CEO for Special Olympics Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Heidi. What a pleasure to be with all of you. I think you'll see our panel discussion today, like I said, really follows the keynote. And Dr. Medora talked about what does Build Back Better mean. So we really want to focus on what that means with SDG 3, ensuring healthcare for all at all ages, and SDG 4, ensuring equitable access to education. Dr. Medora said, building back better means building back fairer. And to me, that's equity and inclusivity. Dr. Jennifer Guevara, I'd love to have you kind of kick us off with talking a little bit about starting with early childhood development.
Thank you so much. So this panel, as Laura anticipated, is about the role of education and health. And I think early childhood is the period of life in which these two definitely cannot be separated. It is the period in which development, education, and care are more interweaved and more inseparable than in any other moment of a person's life. Actually, I think sometimes it is good to remind ourselves that children live their lives as a whole, and it is our work as adults to welcome them into the world with wide and, we could say, holistic arms. This is also why, despite early childhood being included in SDG 4 and specifically targeted in Target 2 regarding education, I think early childhood goes way beyond that. Early childhood, easy from now, to make it shorter, it's transsectoral, and therefore integrated policies are key to achieving at least 7 of the SDGs. on poverty, hunger, health, education, care, gender, water, sanitation, and inequality. Quite a lot. In fact, as many have been arguing, I do subscribe to the idea that EC policies can be and should be an enabler and an accelerator to achieving all SDGs and explore their interlinked nature as for them to hang together, as Dr. Medora previously mentioned as well. However, our work as adults is usually fragmented and even sometimes atomized. In many countries in the global south and north, because this is not exclusive to the south, instead of competent systems that support the development, education, and care of children, we have built and constructed systems that are incompetent, where policies don't provide coordinated responses, but rather duplicate efforts coming from different sectors and levels of government and overlapping, don't integrate the provision of services, but reinforce silo approaches and silo mentalities, and don't move towards universal access to easy services, but rather multiply programs and policies that often segment and even segregate young children by age and social background. So this was the situation prior to the pandemic, and of course, what COVID-19 did was basically unveiling and deepening the structural weaknesses our systems had. And as we have previously discussed, if we don't act now, we know young children will become the long-term sufferers of the current crisis. Because when elderly people are probably from a medical standpoint, those more at risk, children are the ones that are more at risk when we look at the situation from an educational and social point of view. So we know the situation, and actually when yesterday we were discussing with my fellow panelists how to organize today's discussion, we were saying that we've been analyzing the situation over and over, and we've heard brilliant and timely and accurate analysis. But for us, we think it's time to start discussing how to move forward. How can we move towards universal, easy systems that allow us to achieve all SDGs by 2030? And what's actually the next step to move forward? In 2019, the T20 communique stated that we need a stronger state involvement and collective responsibility. And in many countries, this actually started happening already. We have seen unprecedented state intervention to prevent the immediate collapse of our systems. However, I think that to achieve all SDGs, we need to stop picking up the pieces of broken systems and rebuild and take the necessary step to build resilient and sustainable systems that support education, care, and development of all children. And to work towards that, we probably need territorial approaches. Regional and local governments are increasingly involved in early childhood policies and programs. That has been happening for a while before the pandemic. And there are a number of reasons to think territorial approaches are one of the ways to go. First, because in fragmented systems, subnational levels actually have the potential of reaching all types of services, not only those within education, those within care and health as well. In fact, in our research at DCU and CPEC, we have seen many experiences of integration happening at the local level that never reaches the national eyes, and it cannot be upscaled or duplicated, or we cannot learn from it. Second, because in federal countries, which represent 40% of the world's population, subnational governments actually have the authority over most of the EC programs and policies, not the national level alone. Third, because in marketized systems, it is possible from subnational levels, from the local levels, to attempt and regulate private for-profit and unregistered services, which are now at a huge crisis, by the way. And finally, when they are under a regulation umbrella and when they are properly resourced, financed, they have the potential of providing quality EC programs that recognize this diversity and are able to respond to the rights and needs of communities. So for these territorial approaches to work, there are probably many steps that we should be taking right now. But I would like to close my first remarks with two immediate steps we could be taking to move forward. First, an integrated framework constructed in a participatory way, in a participatory approach that provides an umbrella for local experiences to flourish. And the way in which we produce such a framework is really important, because the role of the framework is to provide an integrated concept, an integrated understanding of what a child is and what education, care, and development is in every and each context. And the second point, and that one I think COVID highlighted more than any other point, is integrated information and monitoring systems. To be able to respond fast and to cope with disruptions, we need to be able to reach one and every child. And to do that, we need to know where they are and what their situation is. So I'll stop here with these first remarks, hand over to my colleagues, and we can continue the conversation moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I can see the themes emerging that again follow nicely on the keynote, which is really like thinking globally is wonderful, but it doesn't change anything unless we facilitate local actions. And I think starting with integrated early childhood development really requires that. How do we facilitate those local actions in countries around the world, not just, again, the global south or poor countries, as we've seen the impact of COVID in all countries, really. I think this is a great, sets the stage for Dr. Yonette Thomas, who will talk to us about what we mean by healthy women, healthy communities, and kind of moving up from early childhood development to the next step. Dr. Thomas?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to step back a little further than my previous colleague did and talk a little more broadly about healthy women and girls and how that impacts healthy communities. I've been recently involved with Dinah and her colleagues in the Women's Economic Imperative as a strategic advisor, been asked to lend my thoughts and thinking to how we critically bring together work that I've been doing with the WHO and other global organizations around strategic preparedness. I'm one of those who've been working on the preparedness for on pandemics like COVID-19 for several years. And as my colleagues and I say, our worst nightmare has come true. So when we think of the landscape, when we think of women and girls, this whole notion, we want to, as everyone has done and as the keynote did, embed this in the Sustainable Development Goals framework. And from my perspective, looking at this, not only goals 3 and 5 are critical, goals 8 and 10 are also bedrock for our thinking about this. And these serve as action points for focusing on the health of women and girls, particularly as an economic value. And this is something critical we must think about. We often don't realize that robust development of communities and municipalities and cities. I talk to mayors about this all the time. I was recently in El Salvador talking to a group of 12 mayors, that the critical development and the economic development of a community and municipality has to be inclusive if everyone is going to benefit. And as we're women and men in this forum, we well know the role our mothers have played in our lives. And I say to my colleagues, if you have a healthy woman, you have a healthy family. Everyone benefits. You have a healthy community. You have a healthy municipality. And what we see across the globe, if we just look at it in terms of gender, women aged 25 to 34 globally are 25% more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. And this retards our growth. My research shows that, and it shows that women and girls stand at the end of the healthcare queue. And increasing investment in their health is not only the right thing to do, it's for our overall benefit and longevity and sustainability of our productive communities. So investing in good health, and particularly health education, is both sustainable and cost effective. And that brings us to the whole discourse. You provide basic health care to women and children, as my colleague says earlier, prevents illness and disabilities. It saves money. It saves billions of dollars that would otherwise be spent in medical treatment. So what is this impact of education and health on the outcomes of women and girls? Well, our research shows that education or reproductive health of women and girls is key to sustainable development across the board. It's not an emotional statement, it's a factual statement. And there's a proven relationship between the education of women and girls, as I said, and public health, overall public health. And our study shows that this education has a positive effect on the health of women and girls. It reduces child mortality, improves maternal health, girls' health problems and related stigma, as we all know, prevent them, particularly in the global South, but in the global North. COVID-19 has exposed the myth that the global North has it all together. Mm-hmm. We realize that that's not quite so true. So education boosts women's income potential and the progress of families. It's beneficial to all. And we see that shocks like COVID-19 have deepened pre-existing inequalities, and they amplify vulnerabilities in health, social, political, and economic systems. This is a given. We're looking at this. This is what in my field we call a natural experiment. It's unfolding before us. And in these situations, it's an opportunity for growth. It sounds morbid, but I keep saying all the talks I'm giving all these days is, this is an opportunity that we must seize. We see that as frontline responders, women are in the health professions, 70% of the global health workforce. They're caregivers in homes and families, and more likely to volunteer to make things better for the community. So they're making critical contributions to address this whole outbreak and any outbreak. And they, as a result, bear a disproportionate share of the adverse health outcomes from things like this. The United Nations report on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls bears this out. The world's formal economies and the maintenance of daily lives are built on the invisible and unpaid labor of women and girls, care of children, older family members, ill family members. Women are doing 3 times as much unpaid care as men, and women predominate in the informal sector and in the service sector, which have been dramatically impacted by the current epidemic and are increasingly impacted by natural disasters, et cetera. And, the reality is COVID-19 as an epidemiologist, I can say to you, is an exemplar of what is to come. And we should seize this opportunity to learn from it. It's not an emotional argument, it's a survival discussion. So this we've seen, to reiterate the point, you look at the case of Spain and Italy, who is disproportionately affected, who's disproportionately exposed. It's the women in healthcare because of the things I said earlier. So what do we do broadly? We know that public health preparedness and response plans are critical. So when we look at all the things that we need to have in place, we need to also consider both the direct and indirect health impacts on women and girls. And the United Nations as a body, the Secretary General of the United Nations has been in the forefront of this, focusing on adequate representation of women in response and recovery planning and implementation, targeted public health messages to women and girls specifically, to engage them, to say, we see you, we realize what you're doing, we get it, you're part of the solution. And addressing specific needs, health, social, and work environment needs, and providing resources and standard health services at all stages of the life course. So in this last decade, and I cannot reiterate and hold my excitement that as a person who likes deadlines and timelines, this last decade presents us with a unique opportunity, not just to realize and achieve the 2030 SDGs, but to really hone in on, we have a disaster, what have we learned, how do we make this better, how do we work together? In this instance, I'm focusing on women and girls. My colleague earlier talked about children and early childhood development. The key issue here is addressing the gender inequities does many things. It brings quality, accessible health to more people. It recognizes, rewards, and facilitates the integral role of women in the care economy as professionals, health professionals, unpaid care provided by women and girls in households. And it boosts the informal sector, because we have to include the informal sector in disaster preparedness. It brings more jobs and increases the productivity of all, hence our communities, the health and well-being of our communities or municipalities or cities and our countries. So this is what I wanted to bring to this discussion this morning, and to say that it is heartening that as the leadership of the T20 coming out of Saudi Arabia, the robustness of conversations like these have been most energizing and opportunistic, and I think very forward-looking. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. Yeah, great presentation, and I think a few points really stuck with me. We don't have an option of not building back better. And I think, as you said, this crisis has both exposed and exacerbated the inequities that exist throughout the world. Again, the global north doesn't have its act together. And many communities have suffered in countries around the world, including in the US, where I'm sitting today. But again, we have to seize this unique opportunity. And COVID-19 is not going to be the last global crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just accepting that is key. I'd love to, setting the stage for Dinah Bennett, who's going to talk to us about creating more opportunities for women in an inclusive way. Dinah, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, and thank you to previous speakers. I'm pleased that the panel has actually asked us to look forward, addressing what can be done in order to achieve the SDGs. And I'd like to focus on two areas that my organisation, the Women's Economic Imperative, has been working on most recently. Enterprise education, focusing on a gendered STEM perspective, science, technology, engineering and math, and also the need to address the digital gender divide. I said this before and I'll continue to repeat it. Empowering women in the economy and closing all the gender gaps are key to achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The work that we recently worked on, looking at the need for enterprise education for women in STEM subjects, and also the significance and importance for G20 countries, in particular the MENA states, by advancing strategies for this, such as the World Economic Forum's goal to educate and train 1 billion people in the next decade, to build capacity and mobilize knowledge needed to create businesses to drive economic growth in the 4th Industrial Revolution. But what do we mean by enterprise education? It's about developing the behaviors, skills, and attributes in individuals to help solve the world problems, but also to cope with change and uncertainty. And someone said it's not the strongest or the most intelligent of the species that are going to survive. It's those that are able to adapt and change in uncertain times. And I think we certainly are seeing this now. And enterprise education is about the process by which these behaviours are practiced and supported. Based on the principles of enterprise education, experiential learning provides students with opportunities to develop and apply a range of skills that are essential to employment and also business startup. Enterprise education is also seen to influence entrepreneurial behaviour, and enhanced skills associated with opportunity spotting, problem solving, communication, and teamwork. A whole range of other competencies too, but we think it's incredibly important to recognise that enterprise education is also beneficial to those students who struggle with traditional curricula, and we've already heard looking at early childhood development. Many countries in the MENA region are really pushing the participation of women in STEM. This is important because engagement in STEM is associated with innovation, research and development, tech transfer, and economic prosperity. STEM professionals solve complex and global and local challenges. This is of paramount importance for countries seeking to diversify strategically from economic dependence on oil and countries struggling with economic instability, unemployment, and poverty. Multiplier effects are expected given that women small business owners are more likely than men to hire women and retain women in managerial and leadership roles. Yet many women globally are underrepresented in STEM occupations and small business ownership. And the following challenges stymie inclusion and economic growth, and this is what we found from our research. Career readiness in STEM education. Despite academic qualifications, many women in STEM are unprepared for employment or entrepreneurial careers. And this is partly due to limited internships and internships and placements. The absence of employment and enterprise skills in STEM curricula as a whole. So curricula typically excludes these employment skills and small business training, which we do need. Mobility and flexibility for career advancement. STEM careers often entail international travel, sequential and short-term posts, long days and work in laboratories and away from home. And women's responsibility as caregivers add another layer of challenges for this work. There is a massive lack of role models and mentors, but also the absence we found from our research of tailored support for professional women in STEM areas. It's really important when we actually found out that 1 in 3 startups are women founded in Arab countries, which is fantastic compared to 1 in 10 in the main. First, the technology industry in Arab countries is relatively new. Second, 70% of the population in the MENA region is under 30 years of age, a demographic that is highly engaged in the digital economy. Third, the internet is helping to overcome these physical boundaries of work in homes, cities and countries where gender and other systemic biases often persist. So we're seeing finally many women entrepreneurs in the MENA region believe that technology is one of the few occupational spaces where everything is possible, including breaking gender norms. So I think in terms of concrete actions, and this isn't exclusively for the MENA region at all, we can have a call to action to include provide enterprise education, including experiential and entrepreneurial approaches to learning, to equip students with entrepreneurial mindsets and other personal competencies that contribute to society, and introduce gender-sensitive educational practice within the system and create global labs. This moves me on to the second area of the digital gender divide. Technology and the internet, as we've seen, can be a great enabler for us all, but a lack of opportunity, skills from using and creating digital tools and online content is actually stopping women and girls participating. I think it's really important that the technology gap, if we found there's a report that said 600 million more women are connected to the internet in 3 years, this would translate to a rise in global GDP of between 13 and 18 billion. Today, the digital transformation provides new avenues for the economic empowerment of women and can contribute to greater gender equality. The internet, digital platforms, mobile phones, and digital finance services offer leapfrog opportunities for all and can help bridge this divide by giving the women possibility to earn more and increase employment opportunities. Finally, an OECD report in 2018 categorically stated that acting now to reverse these trends can offer greater inclusion for women. The concrete policies for action that we're calling for and what's needed to foster this is increased affordability, empowering users through education, improving the relevance of online content, again through education, better and greater internet infrastructure development and addressing this gender gap in internet access, but most importantly, measuring through gender disaggregated data. Coordinated policy action now can help narrow this digital gender divide, and this requires action across the piece, raising awareness and tackling stereotypes, enabling enhanced, safer and more affordable access to digital tools. The cost of inaction is high, and in the face of the current pandemic, we have to work in partnership to achieve these G20 goals. So yes, we have to build back better and fairer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dinah. Dinah. I mean, so much stuck with me with what you said, and it follows this, the other speakers, which is investing in addressing this digital divide and the lack or gender inequities is not only the morally right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do.
Absolutely.
Economically, financially, for global development and growth and responding to this, this crisis. I think that sets the stage nicely for Dr. Heidi, who's been very patient. Dr. Heidi Laskari will talk more about what we mean by inclusivity and kind of addressing, how do we bring diversity, inclusivity in concrete ways to what we're talking about. I'll turn it over to you, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Laura. The beauty of being the last one to speak on the panel is you have the wisdom that's been given by everyone who goes before you, who set the stage beautifully. And it's always a pleasure to be part of a panel that very much builds on each other and is sort of in sync. And I think there's a lot of terms that resonate with me and sort of get the light bulbs going off in my head when I listen to everybody speak. Concepts around universality, talking about, for all, no one left behind. We're planning for everyone, building back better, building back fair. I want to throw a number out, and I am going to stop for a split second because I want you all to close your eyes and think about this number. Think about how big this number is, 8.5 billion people. 8.5 billion people is the estimated number of the world population in 2030. Every single one of us here are talking about within our own niches, in our own sectors, to be inclusive. We are responsible for 8.5 billion people. Can we equitably give everybody those opportunities? Educational, employment, health, opportunities, socialization, inclusion. Those numbers are very critical when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because the first thing that always strikes me is we always speak with the assumption that we have the same definition in mind when we're speaking. When I say diversity and inclusion from my lens, I'm thinking of a huge category of individuals, persons with disabilities, males, females, young, older. And when I think about the weight of responsibility as policymakers, as researchers, as decision makers, when I think of the weight of that responsibility to plan and be responsible for every single one of those categories, although I don't like to talk about people in categories, but in essence, that's what we do. When we plan our research, there's always inclusion, exclusionary criteria. When we talk about policies, we try and define and we use these terms lightly. But when we think about the impact of these decisions that we make and how we make them, I think it's really important to start really thinking about each and every one of those numbers. When I talk about even today, even from a Middle Eastern perspective, we have a huge focus on youth, and a huge focus on women today. And yet I have seen through my experience very interesting research coming out of the region. One being reverse gender discrimination. We are seeing our boys fall behind. We are very honored to have on our next panel Natasha Ridge, who's done some really interesting research in the UAE that's showing that because of the focus on women, sometimes now the boys are falling behind. So is that a fair statement? And when you come into arguments about this discussion, it's, well, it's this faction versus that faction and this group versus that group. You know, the whole movement today, again, I think Yonette was saying COVID is an opportunity. I think 2020 as a whole, with all of the factors and all of the interesting developments that have happened, has been an amazing opportunity. We've seen a lot of discussion about very difficult topics come up that are really important to be talking about. One category, if I can throw out there, that is completely missing that I see in this whole arena is the aging population. We talk about people above 60 or above 65 as if, you know, well, they're a very small minority, we don't have to worry about it. But everything that we're planning today, whether it's education, technology, their lives literally depend on it. How we make decisions in our healthcare system. We've seen that with COVID, prioritization of medical services, who gets and who doesn't get these medical services. I personally know several people with disabilities who passed away during this time because they were outrightly told, do not come to the hospital. We have other triaging priorities to take care of. And this is blatantly being said. So I just want to maybe focus this on, let's be cognizant when we say diversity and inclusion. Let's really be cognizant when we say for all. Certainly, if we compare, I really appreciated the keynote speech referring to MDGs versus SDGs. In the space of diversity and inclusion, the SDGs came about and they were blatantly and very overtly stated that this was going to be an inclusive framework. And when we look at it, disability, gender, and other groups are, they are literally mentioned across several of the SDGs. Disability, for example, has specific KPIs in Goal 4, Goal 8, Goal 11, Goal 17, right there that we can measure in Goal 10, and that really impacts everything. When we talk about this too, whether we're looking at disability or gender, we also forget to look at the compounding effects. Yonette gave some beautiful examples of women in the healthcare system and where they are. And while I feel Yonette's illustration of numbers may be more on the positive, inspirational side, there are some darker sides to those numbers. Women and girls with disabilities experience multiple and interesting forms of discrimination and exclusion, which has an impact on their ability to meet basic needs, even in normal times. Women with disabilities are 3 times more likely to have unmet healthcare needs, 3 times more likely to be illiterate, 2 times less likely to be employed, and 2 times less likely to use the internet in comparison with men without disabilities. So how do we start taking all of these numbers and all of these concepts, and as policymakers and researchers start to become inclusive? What I recommend, and what we're seeing a lot from a lot of the task forces that I have the honor to sit on and speak with and work with, and a lot of people who are doing some amazing work in this area, is first and foremost, we have to make it part of our DNA. We have to take a step back. Is it a category that we address? Or when we, as the G20 and contributors to T20 process, particularly T20 that focuses on research, do we actually start making it one of the requirements that the policies we develop, there's a checklist that says this truly was an inclusive policy, and inclusion means this for us. It really means including all of these high-risk categories, marginalized individuals in our communities. We see this in research as well. A good example of this that we've seen, particularly within the digital world, is facial recognition. If you are following a lot of the research in that domain, they found that a lot of the new technology that's coming out can only identify white Caucasians. Everybody else is not being recognized by the system. What does that mean for persons with disabilities, persons who were born with facial anomalies, persons who are not white Caucasian? And what does that exclude them from in terms of educational opportunities? If tomorrow I have to sit down at my desk and be recognized by my unit to be able to get into a classroom, if the research is not very conscious about having this wide spectrum of the beautiful colors of what makes up humanity, then how are we going to be able to include them in technology? So again, COVID has really shone the light on this, the ability to access. I have colleagues who were born without limbs. The idea of simple fingerprinting becomes a huge challenge. If the only way you can get in and access something is through a fingerprint, you're no longer included in that process, and it's a long, tedious process to try and work around those things. The beauty of starting to look at this slightly different, instead of categorizing humans in terms of categories, why don't we start categorizing the challenges? Because once we start looking at challenges, we find that many of these cohorts and many of these groups have similar challenges, irrespective of the categories that they belong to. So if we start to look from a different perspective and a different lens, we may find that some of our policies can sweepingly address some of the challenges out there in a very cost-effective, efficient, and impactful way for everyone. I would like to propose a framework that was proposed by as the Global Compact of Inclusive and Accessible Cities. It comes from a lot of the work on urbanization and a group that was formed called Cities for All that proposes a very simple 6 key principle framework to start looking at everything in terms of development and developing cities and smart cities, and whether it's health, education, socialization, within this framework, we can become more inclusive. So the key principles are, 1, non-discrimination. It sounds easy. It's very aspirational. Everybody says yes, but in implementation, it needs to be there in terms of very conscious, and we are really making an effort to non-discriminate. Accessibility. Access to information, sign language interpretation, multiple languages, various versions of what we're trying to put out there. In the technology age, there are so many easy fixes and options that we can start looking at, whether it's the digital accessibility, the physical accessibility, or policy accessibility, making sure our policies are accessible. Participation. This is the hard one. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy, but it is worth every penny in the long run. If we are participatory and we include everyone in participation and we take the time, we come up with better solutions that meet everyone's needs. Inclusive urban policies and programs, capacity building. This is a big one, and I think we'll hear this across a lot of the themes today. If COVID-19 has taught us nothing, it has taught us that what we have trained to be our whole lives is sometimes out the door. Today, parents are teachers. Today, family members are caregivers. So in the past, where I could hire somebody to come in and care for a member of my family who might be aging or have medical conditions, or my child who may or may not have a disability, today I am that caregiver. Me, you, people sitting, watching this webinar today have been asked, and actually the situation has demanded that we become something we were never trained to do because we don't have access to their services. So capacity building, access to skills that are needed. One of the things we saw in our own task force is, again, we talk about youth and we talk about educating youth and education that leads to gainful employment. But what about today there's no such thing as education ends with school or university. It has to be ongoing, lifelong. So what happens to those of us who are in middle age that are not necessarily as tech savvy as the youth, but we haven't reached that age where maybe we don't have to completely do it for our livelihoods. But today, we need to know these skills and we have to learn them quickly. And we don't have the luxury of a year, 2 years, 6 months to do it. You have to learn it overnight. You have to be able to get onto this technology immediately. I personally use over 30 platforms just to do my day-to-day work. That is an immense jump in terms of cognitive needs, which leads into, when you're talking about capability building, mental health. Mental health and wellness has come to the fore again in terms of COVID and what we're looking at, and the ability on a personal level to deal with our mental wellness, as well as deal with it within the educational settings and the health settings moving forward. Data for development is the sixth key principle, and it's the critical one. Without data in terms of policy development and in terms of research, we really don't move. It is sort of the key magic ingredient for us to be able to mobilize a lot of what we're trying to do. So if you are not present in the data and you are not represented, and we saw this again, particularly in disability and the aging populations with COVID, we just don't know. We don't know how many people necessarily exist. We don't know where they reside. They're unable to come out of their homes, and they just don't get served. And hence, we saw a lot of tragic stories coming out of, I'll share one of them that was absolutely heartbreaking early on out of Asia, where a gentleman was diagnosed with COVID, and he had said, my 17-year-old son, who's quadriplegic, is at home, and he cannot leave the house. Can somebody check on him? This young man stayed for 6 days without being fed, without being checked on, and he passed away, only because nobody could document where he was and nobody could look after him and check on him. These are stories that will be part of our legacy and part of our history, simply because we didn't want to have the hard discussion and make the effort to be truly inclusive and diverse. So I urge all of us to rethink about our framework. The framework exists, it's out there. It really just takes conscious effort, checklists, double check, checks and balances, and making a conscious effort to be truly inclusive. So yes, I'm fully on board for building back better and fully inclusive so that we all benefit from all of the amazing work that we're all doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Wow. I appreciated that kind of the weight of what we're talking about, 8.5 billion people and the diversity of those people, but also really appreciate your desire not to categorize people by what they don't have or what they are or what they look like. Really challenging. We only have a few minutes, but I would love to get a little conversation going if possible. I'm thinking about the weight. The G20 policymakers have enormous responsibilities. We've all talked about many priorities, which are all interconnected. How do we help policymakers ensure that they seize the opportunity of this crisis that we've all talked about, and not just the things a year from now or 2 years from now don't go back to the old normal? How can we ensure that this opportunity really allows us to build back better? Whether it's in early childhood development, in giving equitable opportunities to women, healthcare workers, protecting them. I mean, it's overwhelming when you think about all these different issues. So where do we start? And anyone can jump in. Yes, Yonette.
Heidi, thank you. That was a breath of fresh air, and it's almost as if we've been working together for years. I tend to take a positivistic view because I deal with all the morbidities and all the morbid stuff on a daily basis. I think what you outlined, I'm very familiar with the Cities for All framework. I think, to answer your question, Madam Moderator, Heidi's call, and I certainly don't forget men and boys. I have colleagues who focus specifically on that. It requires, as I say to people, an all hands on deck approach, which is what that call is. And what we have started here in this aspect of the T20, from the Saudi leadership, we must continue. It's these networks, these conversations must become capsules that create pods, that create the organism, that develop into the frame for the G20, because we cannot go back. You have the director of the International Monetary Fund saying, we cannot develop forward economic plans without discussions with our epidemiologists. That's a start. And what you've spoken about, Heidi, I think we need to take this, and I'm serious, because I am in so many conversations like this on a daily basis, on a global, you talk about this. And my anxiety is that we are just having conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So we must think, as we talk about the G20, the Think 20 propels the G20 to act. We are the instruments. Heidi, Dinah, we all are. And these conversations must be not just curated, but brought together and given a focus. And I call on the Saudi leadership, as you pass the flag on to Italy and India, to say, make these conversations matter. That's where we begin.
Fabulous.
From my
Thanks.
perspective.
Absolutely. Dinah?
No, just to add to that, I totally agree. And also to go back to Heidi's point that masculinity is absolutely fundamental. And please don't think, because when we talk about gender, it's about men and women, it's critical. But I love what you're talking about, holistic inclusiveness, it's important. But yes, Yonette, make these conversations matter, let people listen, but also it's about putting things into practice. It's about then action after the conversations. We can't just afford to be a talking shop, so we need concrete actions too.
Fabulous. Jennifer?
I agree, and it really resonates with me, everything that's been said. It's actually a risk within our little community to become a community of having conversations, and having conversations between academics and between practitioners, but usually or not always involving with policymakers. So I guess making this conversation matter also involves involving and engaging as many policymakers as we can. And I do think that this argument that is getting more and more attention from different aspects, you mentioned it, Yonette, it's a question of survival. So early childhood education is today education for survival. Working with women, it's a question of survival. And you could say that with most of the topics we've been discussing today. So I think it's a question of putting the argument out there and involving as many actors as we can in the conversation.
Fabulous. If you think about it, I mean, we've all somehow crossed that digital divide. We're sitting around the world having this amazing conversation with really thought leaders. I mean, it's overwhelming when you think about that this is possible today. And yet, as Heidi said, there's so many people that risk being left behind if we don't approach this in an inclusive way. And not everyone has the opportunity to engage in a conversation like this. Heidi, would love to just hear your thoughts again on kind of, let's do it. Let's build back better.
Let's do it. And I think, I mean, the G20 platform obviously it's a big policy research platform. I think one of the components that would be nice to be seen is some repository and some way of connecting the actual actionables and tools. I think, Yonette, I'm so glad to hear that you're involved with the Cities for All and the Compact. But I know even when we were talking about those things, we had said there are so many amazing tools that are buried out there that nobody really knows about. So making a conscious, when we come to these meetings, to say, okay, here's what I'm struggling with, but I will also gift you a tool that you can take away and use, and maybe use in your communities. Because at the end of the day, I think it's very easy to just say, well, it's your responsibility and it's government's responsibility. And I know in another discussion when we were talking about, for instance, child cybersecurity, there was a big discussion. Is it the parents' responsibility? Is it government's responsibility? Is it a school's responsibility to make sure that children stay safe in the cyber world? My answer is it's each and every one of us. All of us are responsible. So I think, the beauty of what we've seen in COVID is people have left this, it's you, it's me, and we've seen communities come together to say collectively, how do we each fill a gap that collectively makes a holistic picture where I can help you, you can help me, but together we help everyone. And my hope, what goes on from here, is that camaraderie, those connections. Whereas in the past, as you said, Laura, oh, I'm sorry, I can't make the meeting, I can't contribute because I couldn't get on the flight and get there. We don't have that excuse anymore. We know this can work. We know I can be talking to Yannette right now and then be talking to somebody in Antarctica tomorrow. So we can now harness that collective think tank in a way we've never been able to do before. And it is our collective responsibility to maintain it, augment it, document it, and make it accountable, and not only bring thoughts and analysis to the table, but bring actionables that even if it can't help every single person, it may help in some small way. And through those small steps, we build a better collective future for everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Heidi. I'd really like to thank the organizers and all of our panelists who brought a lot of different perspectives, and I think really showed us, even though this is very complex and everything is related, I mean, it's a system within a system within a system, there are very concrete things that each one of us can do. And I'm inspired to do what I can, and I really want to thank the organizers, thank T20 and Jitendra. And with that, I'll turn it back to you for our next discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, ladies, for an invigorating debate. The points raised by all of you are indeed prescient. And I hope that it not only helps shape future debates, but also acts as initiatives for people watching to take forward and own them. Moving forward, we have a very special and very interesting art presentation by a Saudi artist. Art is a universal language transcending barriers of language and time, and T20 uses art to communicate its themes, priorities, and policy recommendations to all. It is indeed my honor and privilege to introduce Abdullah Idris. Mr. Idris is a Saudi artist who was born in Saudi Arabia. His art offers to move between different viewpoints, perspectives to adjust to a new way of looking through things. He lives and works in Jeddah. This mixed media with acrylic and oil pastels on newspaper artwork that Mr. Idris is going to present is called Personas Out of Body. This artwork by Abdullah Idris seems at first glance to be abstract figurines. However, as one approaches more closely, the image shows panels with faces behind it. The thought behind the piece is to raise the question of whether the figure is evaluating the viewer from behind a cultural barrier, or whether the viewer is sympathizing with what he assumes is a prisoner. If there is a consistency in the exhibition of the artwork, it is the idea of duality, alternative viewpoints, and conflicting, though reconcilable perspectives. In line with the SDGs of a better blueprint for all, the artwork moves between asking questions pertaining to how to achieve these goals for all. We are now going to watch the video.
العمل التشكيلي هو نص بصري أكثر منه موضوعي. هو يحمل دلالاته وموضوعيته ويمكن تفسيره حسب رؤية المشاهد له. أي عمل فني الآن، الأعمال المعاصرة مرتبطة بواقعها اللي يعيشه المجتمع أو الحدث أو بشكل عام، يعني مرتبط وطبعا بكل نواحي الحياة. نحن نعيش يمكن متغيرات في معاصرة أكثر، متغيرات في التقنية، في الاقتصاد، في السياسة، كلها هذه تنعكس على العمل التشكيلي بشكل غير مباشر. الفنان المعاصر الآن يختلف رؤيته حسب معطيات العصر اللي نعيشه. فبطبيعة الحال إنه الفنان يتأثر ببيئته، بطبيعة بيئته ومجتمعه، وينعكس في الأعمال نفسها.
We are now going to be joined by Mr. Idris, who will speak about his artwork. He will be speaking in Arabic. Please note that English to Arabic translation is available. If you need it, select the language by audio language by clicking the interpretation tab at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. You have our attention, Mr. Idris. Please go ahead.
أتمنى أن أبدأ من النهاية. اسمحوا لي أتكلم باللغة العربية بحيث أنه آخر المستجدات التي وصلت إليها، ولكن لابد للفنان أن يعرف بنفسه، يعرف بأعماله وكأنها السيرة الذاتية. العمل الفني والكلمة كانتا ثنائي تصاحبني منذ البدايات، منذ السبعينات. بداية السبعينات بدأت كعمل فني ناضج إلى حد ما، وطبعا كنت الهاجس الوحيد كان البحث عن الذات الفنية، بحيث يعني يكون لي بصمتي وتميزي، وكنت أبحث عنه. كان فكري أو هاجسي أن الفن إذا ما صاحبه فكر ما أعتقد أنه يستمر بشكل جيد ويؤثر. فكانت الكلمة تصاحبني في كل مسيرتي. هاجسي كان أو عشقي كان للشعر. الشعر موحي بالفن وبفن التشكيل والرسم. السيرة الذاتية إذا تكلمنا عنها كانت ألخصها بهذا الشكل. يعني أنا كنت أبحث عن الخروج من حدود المساحة الجغرافية، بمعنى أني أكون شامل وليس محلي فقط لأصل العالم. الجغرافيا والطبيعة والمدينة أتلمس حدود العالم اللا متناهي. فكان التقاليد أيضا الفن أنا أعتقد غير يعني مرتبط بالتقاليد والعادات والأشياء دي، لأنه الفن غير يقيني. الفن حتى يصبح عالمي لابد أن يفتح الحدود والجغرافيا للعالم ويتواصل. الآن نحن نعيش المرحلة هذه. العالم الآن أصبح متقارب ومتواصل مع بعضه، فبالتالي هوية الإنسان لا تكمن في الشكليات، ولكن تكمن في المعنى والفكر. أنا الآن أتواصل معكم في كل أنحاء العالم، فبالتالي لابد من إيجاد رسالة شاملة وشمولية. أتحدث بشكل ملخص عن مراحلي التي مريتها. طبعا كل فنان أول ما يبدأ بالبيئة المحيطة فيه، بمجتمعه، بأشياءه يعبر عنها، ثم يمر بمراحل أخرى. المرحلة الأخيرة اللي أنا يعني مشغول فيها وببحث فيها وقرأت عنها وشاهدتها هي مرحلة أو أستلهم منها فكرة رسوم الصخور والكهوف في المملكة والجزيرة العربية. هذه عمرها يمكن آلاف السنين، لا أستطيع أن أحدد، وهي تعبر عن الفنان الأول، الفنان البدائي الذي استطاع أن يعبر عن هويته وعن طقوسه وأشياءه. الفنان التشكيلي إذا أردنا أن نستلهم منها الأشياء دي لا يوثقها، ولكن يستلهم منها ويعطيها الطابع الفني التشكيلي. أنا قدمت عدة معارض تحت عنوان أحاثير بهذا المعنى، وحسست أنه لاقت يعني قبول واهتمام من كثير من الناس والنقاد. الصورة التي في ذهني أنه أنا أرتكز إلى تراث قديم جدا، ولكن لابد أنهض به وأضخه إلى العالم بشكل معاصر جديد.
Thank you, sir, for the explanation of the thought behind your artwork. The video of the artwork presentation will be available on the T20 YouTube channel. We now turn to the next panel on the role of innovation in science and technology and its impact on achieving sustainable development goals. Dr. Sadiq Said Mohammed, Director, Center for Communication and IT Research, Research Institute, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, will be moderating this panel. Dr. Sadiq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me loud and clear? Can you all hear me, please?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. I just want to make sure if all the panelists are around. Immi, yes, I can see you now. And I think Aliami is over here, and Dr. Sachin is also over here. Good. So let's get started. I think we are on time. The whole session will last for about 15 minutes. And I think it's going to be extremely interesting for the attendees. Yesterday we had a dry run and Jitendra came up with some fantastic points, and I took a summary of those, and some are important. Firstly, in terms of introduction, introduce yourself briefly, definitely less than 30 seconds. And you don't have to say what's already on the net or web. We'll find you and read it up. Second is, this was Jitendra's idea, and I think it's fantastic. He said, let's discuss things beyond the policy brief. Whatever's in the policy brief, we can always go and read it. Let's go and look into the implementation challenges, evaluation and monitoring, and how can we discuss education for all, especially that of science and technology. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Sadiq. I'm a professor of computer sciences and engineering in King Fahd University. For those who are from outside the kingdom, that's the elite university of the kingdom. Like every country has one. We also have one graduate school, which is different. I've been in the area of higher education for over 40 years with passion, not only for higher education, but also because of the availability of technology and resources in abundance and free, to see that it also gets to the underdeveloped and poor countries. We will bring this up after listening to the panelists. I have, in the order of what was provided by Jitendra, he put the ladies first. We'll start with Immi. Briefly introduce yourself, and we could finish the round of introduction first, or we could do that when you get your turn. I think we'll do that in sequence. Let's listen to Immi, and then you make your points, and then we'll go to Natasha, and then to Dr. Chaturvedi, and then to Dr. Aliami, and we'll also listen to Jitendra if we have time. Immi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I will start. Well, first introducing myself, I am at the German Development Institute. I'm also a member of the German Council for Sustainable Development, which gives advice to the Chancellor. And these two identities are complementary, but not always. And I am active in the T20 since 2016 and following the SDG topic as it has been dealt with consecutively and differently across the different presidencies. So this panel now focuses on science and technology as an important tool for sustainable development. And in our policy brief, which we wrote with quite a large group, mostly of young global academics, we started to formulate it very early. As you will remember, we were asked to hand in the first drafts by April And from the beginning, we realized we will not be able to look at the SDGs or at sustainable development anymore in the same way after or with the corona crisis. But when you look at our policy brief now, you will see that we had no idea how it would really roll out. And I think that this is an important characteristic of the pandemic, that we still do not know it. We do not know how many waves there will come. We do not know, we can project poverty figures. I think we are pretty sure about the economic fallout and the massive effect it will have on public budgets throughout. But so many things are uncertain. So for me, that is the first thing, the first argument actually for saying how important science and technology is. Because we have, for example, seen that governments in countries who did not follow an evidence-based approach for understanding the pandemic, the virus, first of all, and then for dealing with it, are faring badly. And another thing is that when we look at the effects, when we want to understand the effects of the pandemic on sustainable development as such, but also on public policies to act, what to focus on, we immediately see that we cannot advance on that without data, without research which helps us understand and interpret the data, and with ongoing research on the manifold consequences of the pandemic and the feedback effects it will have. So, so that makes, in a way, the transition towards sustainable development much more difficult. When we did the policy brief, our main approach was that we said, for taking up its responsibility and leveraging the full potential of the G20, towards sustainable development, and now towards sustainable development and dealing with the corona crisis, we think, and I am pretty sure about that, the G20 needs to change its work structures, to really understand the nature of integrated complex problems and find the right mix of instruments for dealing with them. So our understanding is that orienting the G20 agenda on the 6 entry points for sustainable transformation proposed by the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019, and is one important step. And the second important step is to focus on 2 levers, on economy and finance, so on economic and financial policies, and on science and technology. And when we analyze what the G20 has been doing so far and how its work streams and its working groups relate to these entry points and to the levers, we see that science and technology has been disregarded nearly completely by the G20. This year, digital economy is an area which we can count as dealing a lot with science and technology, but in general, it has been neglected. So this is an important, I think the point we made here grew in importance over time. Regarding now science and technology more specifically, our proposal is that it is important that G20 acts collectively in orienting science and technology policies for sustainable development. What does it mean? It means to invest substantially more in science. And science here, we mean both social and natural sciences. It needs to invest more in schooling, in universities, so that to make sure that academic training is accessible for all and not only or mainly to the privileged. It needs to promote the diversity of science, as I've said, because sustainability affects all sectors in society and thus requires a broad range of scientific disciplines to work on it. and also to make sustainability research an attractive career for researchers. That is not a trivial point, because sustainability requires interdisciplinary approaches. And in most universities, you don't make a career when you work that way. Mostly you make a career when your research is focused on one discipline and on one very specific topic. We think that for putting more emphasis on science and technology, the G20 should task its ministers responsible for science and technology to ensure its policies and institutions enable scientists to develop global responses to global challenges, as framed by the GSDR. So to underpin it with political decisions and recognition of the importance of science and technology, and to invest in the ability, that is also important, of both researchers and policymakers to learn to interact more productively at the science policy interface. When we look at the corona crisis, we see that it has three major impacts at the moment, and these impacts have an effect in the short and in the long term on sustainable development. The first one is clearly on human capabilities, and we heard a lot about that also in the previous session. So health, education, gender equality, research capacities, poverty. And on economic, the second impact obviously is on economic activity, so on employment, on households' incomes, on tax income, and on public budgets, and the ability of governments to act, both against the crisis and in favor of tackling global sustainability challenges, which today is being discussed under the heading of Building Back Better. And I think it is important that G20 embraces that approach as well. So, as I've said, our analysis has shown that the G20 is still not fit for actually acting accordingly, because its work on sustainability issues is concentrated very much under the Sherpa track, while the use of economic and fiscal policies as levers of sustainability transformation is concentrated under the finance minister's track. And this separation is not very helpful for leveraging the weight of the G20 and make it act in accordance with its global responsibility. So our proposal is that instead, G20 work streams need to come together across both the different entry points, which cover human well-being, it covers sustainable and just economies, it covers food systems, global environmental commons, gender equality, urban and peri-urban transformation. So it needs to come across, so the work streams need to come together on the levers, on the entry points, and it is important to stimulate policy reforms and action. And I think this is an important point in the G20 for evaluating their experiences together and learn, because nobody has a blueprint. And it's extremely important that all countries share their experiences in action. So science and technology is central, but the G20 hardly acts on it. The countries where scientific evidence is not taken as a basis, I just repeat these main points so they stick with us in the discussion. So countries where scientific evidence is not taken as a basis for understanding COVID-19 and suppressing it have fared and are faring badly. It's not only that, but because of course the quality and outreach coverage of health system is crucial, and that whether you have social security systems or not. But scientific evidence is also important for making these systems work effectively. A second point is that sustainability transformations are knowledge intensive. At the same time, they are context specific, and they are under pressure of global change in climate, in economics, and technology, and contribute to it. So for accelerating change, cooperation in learning and in evaluating experiences is important for implementation. And finally, freedom of science obviously is fundamental. And this includes the opportunity to engage freely in global collaboration initiatives of science, in research and in training. That's my main points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. reminds me of a few things. You did mention people working in silos in their disciplines, but today the trend is changing, and the world's best universities have realized that knowledge is generated on the interfaces of disciplines. And that has become sort of a metric now to see how the universities are progressing. You did talk about the uncertain future. I've been somehow connected to an organization in San Jose called the Institute for the Future, IFTF, if you've heard of them. I just shared the link of one of the presentations with Jitender, and he can send it to all participants. Complimentary, fantastic. It's so beautiful, Imi, that every time I listen to it, I start again. And it's so educative because they look at the signals around the world and they try to predict, and they also show you from history what they did in the past, what are the predictions they made, and they came out right. You did talk about unemployment, hunger, education, etc. And there are a few other aspects also, especially in densely populated countries. One of them that bothers me a lot is domestic violence, which is on the rise, etc. I think we'll go to, since we said ladies first, did we? So it's Natasha. I forgot to mention, let's keep it between 5 and 7 minutes, so we'll have more time for discussion. You may start.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq. And I'd just like to say a thank you to Jitendra and to all the team at the T20 for putting this together. It's really a wonderful opportunity and such a pleasure for me to be a part of. My name is Natasha Ridge, as Dr. Sadiq has just said, and I'm the Executive Director of the Al-Qasimi Foundation for Policy Research. We are based in the Emirate of Ras Al Khaimah in the UAE. And my background and really area of interest and specialization is education policy. I am very interested in how the impact of COVID-19, not just on the UAE, but on the GCC and others, but also for this panel's purpose on how technology and science and technology are really playing a role in that, and what are some of the key challenges. So today, for what I'm going to talk about briefly is innovation in education for science and technology. And I'm just going to look at three ways or three methods that we might increase innovation in science technology in education itself. And some of it will be building off what Imi said, but that's more at higher ed. I'll look a bit more at school education. So the first one that I really want to talk about is a greater focus on inclusion and equity. And we've heard that talked about in the previous panel as well. We talked about in terms of women, and in terms of students with disability or people with disabilities. But I really want to also talk about low-income people. We talked about poverty, but anyone from a low SES background. And we know that SES is really the main driver of inequality globally. So what we really need to see, and this has been so salient in COVID-19, is that we need low-cost solutions for low-income communities. We've seen exacerbating of educational inequalities because of a lack of infrastructure for improving learning, improving research in science and technology, particular around in higher education with access to labs, inadequate funding for laboratories, lack of access even to the most basic thing like power supplies, access to the internet, something that was also mentioned, but really this is a human right that so many are lacking. And then in academia as well, a lack of access to scientific journals in many countries around the world, which really exacerbates the knowledge gap between the low and high income countries. So this is the first point around that for inclusion. Secondly, and I think others touched on this in the earlier panel, is addressing issues related to poor teacher quality, or not, I wouldn't say or instructor, but like deficiency in learning. How do we help upskill teachers and academics in countries where they haven't had that opportunity? We do a lot of work with some country in Zanzibar and Tanzania, and really are looking at retooling, retraining, and upskilling, because a lot of these people are not able to provide for their own constituents the skills that they need, especially around science and technology. So I think it's really important that we think about the inequalities inherent in this at the moment. It's not just the infrastructure, it's also the skills of the people delivering science and technology instruction to students. On the PISA study recently, it says that up to 50% of the SES gap in math can be explained by a lack of access to high quality math content and instruction. So we know that actually this has a direct impact. So the skills of instructors and the skills of people in education to deliver content is highly important and something that we need to think about for reducing inequality. And then I think we've talked about COVID, but the gap that has emerged in COVID-19 between the rich and the poor. And this is in every country globally, whereby students who have more are increasingly having access to better schooling, better education, and particularly around the sciences and technology. My second point is around, just watching the time, the incorporation of arts to see innovation. So what we call from STEM to STEAM. And I think this is really important because we're talking about science and technology, but just a little fun facts that a study of 502 executives at technology companies found that only 37% actually held degrees in engineering or computer technology, and only 2% in maths. The rest had degrees in business, accounting, healthcare, arts, and humanities, including the YouTube CEO, Susan. She majored in history and literature. Airbnb founder, Brian Chesky, majored in fine arts, and Jack Ma has a bachelor degree in English. So when we talk about science and technology, we really need to be aware that it can't just be limited to those disciplines at university. It's really important, and we talked about this, Imi talked about this multidisciplinary approach, that we really bring the arts into this as well. And the arts is very broad, arts and humanities there, because that really gives it, one, it's more inclusive. It's not excluding people from the get-go. So, okay, you studied in English, so therefore you can never enter science and technology and you'll never have a good idea. But actually it says, oh, you can actually, you can get in from multiple entry points into really unique things. And I think Steve Jobs is the ultimate example. He studied calligraphy, and we still, we're working on his beautiful products today. So this real incorporation of STEAM. And I think that what they say is that STEAM is people-centric, not subject-centric, putting the student's personality and individuality at the forefront. So I love this idea of thinking about STEAM, that sometimes in science and technology, we can become very subject-focused or product-focused, but when we bring STEAM into it, we really think about how do people interact with the technologies that we're using. And then my third point, my final point, is about curriculum reform. And again, Imi stole a lot of my thunder with her great points about interdisciplinary work, but it's as true in higher education as it is in K-12. We really, what we've seen in COVID is we need a shift to project-based and community-based learning. We cannot work in single subject silos anymore. We cannot have math and history and all these subjects just standing alone and teach. The more we do the project-based learning, and I love also community-based learning, because now more than ever, we're clustered in our small communities. We're no longer, able to go as far, we can go far virtually, but we are much more connected locally. So I think this is where we really need to see schools and education systems think about how can we incorporate the sciences, the STEM subjects and the STEAM subjects into each other, not just focused on separate pieces. Have project-based learning, have more of this collaboration. And so I just think this would really give us a lot of opportunities going forward. It encourages greater collaboration, and it really helps to develop the entrepreneurial skill sets that was talked about also in the previous panel. So I'm going to leave there. I've got challenges, but I'll save those for the Q&A. So thank you, Dr. Sadiq.
Thank you, Natasha. I'll just take a minute to summarize what I grasped from what you said and what is important for me. If we can summarize one solution in one word for all these problems and all countries, that would be infrastructure.
Yes.
I think if we can take care of that, we will solve a large number of problems, because as I mentioned even yesterday, research resources are available as preprints and e-prints even for people in poor countries and poor people like in Bangladesh or India or in Indonesia or wherever. But if somebody has minimal infrastructure, does not have to be state-of-the-art devices, even one generation behind, then I think they have access to resources. There are sites where you have almost every book, including my own book, available. That's not a problem anymore. Hardware is available for free. Amazon, Google, etc. will give you hardware on the cloud. Software is available for free. A large number of resources are available for free. Now, talking about the teachers, even at the university level, if you look at the average teaching quality of a university professor, I think it is B- or less. So that's the same problem with school. But how does technology solve it? Because now students are forming collaboration groups on social media like Facebook, learning themselves. So the teacher is still like, blended learning and the sage on the stage problem being solved, etc. I think that's not going to be a problem anymore. I think infrastructure is going to solve the problem. And again, people who have access or who can afford, it doesn't mean they have access. It doesn't mean that they are the ones who contribute to science in this thing. Mm-hmm. We see some of those who outperform or excel in these academic institutions and innovate and contribute come from the lower strata. And there's proof. People who have slept on the roads have excelled, not only in science, also in arts and music, etc. So I'll leave you at that, and we'll listen to, do we have a doctor in the group other than me and Dr. Jitendra? Oh, Jitendra is not there. Yes, we have Dr. Chaturvedi. So I think it's your turn now to introduce yourself, and you have 5 to 7 minutes. And I checked this morning, you from Delhi, I believe. And you can say more about it. Yes,
thanks, Dr. Sadek. Yes, I am based in Delhi. I work with this think tank called RIS in New Delhi, and we focus on issues related to the interlinkages between trade, investment, technology, and finance. How these four things move and influence each other. I am part of India's national task force on sustainable development goals, but I'm an ardent student of the process of innovation, how innovation takes place, how technologies actually contribute to that, in what way. And being a trained economist, I try to see the economics of science, technology, and innovation, and how they actually contribute in terms of strengthening the national production frontier, contribute to the productivity. And I have been doing this for more than 25 years now. So I have been in the field for long and have been taking interest in this transition. I'm very glad today both Natasha and Emma have focused on issues that are so dear to my heart in terms of STI and its optimum performance. In fact, I was expecting that this time the Nobel Prize would go to some of our fraternity members in economics who have contributed to the idea of national innovation system. But every time we are seeing that the Nobel Committee is not recognizing the role that national innovation system is playing. So I would very much like to request this forum to see that the science, technology, innovation is recognized across the spectrum, and G20 world leaders should, at least as Emma very rightly said, recognize that. And I'm very glad that apart from Sadek, the point that you drew out of Natasha's presentation on infrastructure, which is very appropriate for our discussion. The other point that she also mentioned is in terms of the importance of language and the local capacity. And I think the newly announced education policy in India is now for the first time going to focus on science curriculum in local languages. Being a British colony for long, most of our work has been in English language. And as a result, we are now realizing that after 70 years of our independence, more and more of our kids are getting out of science and not getting into science. And as a result, they are not realizing the process of development and the importance of science, technology, and innovation. So I would very much like to re-emphasize Natasha's point. I just have 3 points, and I would stop in next few minutes. The first point that I want to mention here is something that Dr. Madora has mentioned, is about the wholeness of development. And I think, Dr. Sadek, it's very important for us to realize that the science, technology, innovation can really bring in the robustness that is required in development to solve the larger challenges that not only the G20 countries, but those who are not in G20 are facing in immense ways. So access to clean water, access to clean electricity, access to the primary health care. So what we were discussing under MDGs, there are several countries which are in the age of SDGs, but are still grappling for the first 6 SDGs. So I think science, technology, innovation can really help in that. And the G20 countries should see that the part of the development extension is given there. In fact, even after the Osaka summit was over of the G20, Japanese government came out whole hog to support STI for SDG project. And I'm very glad that 5 African countries have come forward to be a pilot in this. And I would suggest that the Saudi Arabian presidency, which is going to be over down this year, continues this engagement on STI for SDG after the presidency and supports the initiative so that what Japan is doing after their presidency, it becomes a continuation. So that's my first point, which I wanted to make. The second point is more about the idea of access, equity, and inclusion. In the previous panel, it was mentioned that the innovation should not bring in disequilibrium in the society. It should not create any more exclusions. So the adoption of artificial intelligence, the adoption of the Internet of Things, etc., they should not create more exclusions as we are trying to bridge the digital divide. So as efforts are on, and the COVID-19 has really shown the vulnerabilities of not only South, but also of the North. So the idea of SDGs is very much relevant for North as well. They are not insulated from development challenges, which we thought a couple of years ago. And in fact, some of the most powerful heads of states have said that SDGs are for the South. But now we know for very sure in last couple of months, and I see Emma nodding this is very much a reality, and we have to bring that right up. So access, equity, and inclusion are extremely important for the global community, and we need to see that we create institutions that are there, be that multilaterals, be that the SDG gap analysis that OECD has come out with, or we created the global public goods, incentivize the commons and their creation, encourage open innovation, encourage interlinkages between artificial intelligence and development. The recent proposal by South Africa and India to WTO to free from IPR. In fact, we had discussions with the Italian presidency, and the Sherpa of Italian presidency very clearly said that during their presidency, they would like to demand free trade in health goods, which are specific to health. So that dimensions, I think, are extremely important, and we bring in fact, the vaccine summit that was hosted by the UK Prime Minister emphasized on the role that Gavi has placed, and I'm glad that Dr. Madonna talked about COVAX, and I think Rohinton's point was largely in terms of how the countries can come together. So short point is access, equity, inclusion should bring in some of these dimensions which are of extreme importance. And third and the last point, Dr. Sadiq, is about governance of technology. And that I think the G20 should emphasize, be that on gene editing, be that on cybersecurity, or on the usage of the nanoparticles. We require a robust governance mechanism for technology so that societal relevance of technology, responsible research and innovation of technology continues. I would stop here. Thank you. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Very valid points, especially the third one, because I am in the area of IT and I understand the issues over there. And your first point of learning science in their mother tongues, that will be a big challenge for India. By the way, I was born in Bangalore. And what you suggest, yes. And I do speak a few South Indian languages quite okay. I can, better than Arabic. The interesting thing is what you said is exactly opposite of what Malaysia did a few years ago. They would teach in Malay language at school, science and technology, but then for science and math, they had a program, and in 2 years, they trained the teachers and transformed completely to teach that in English. And I think they were competing with Singapore after they became different countries. Great. Now, last but not the least, Khitam Mohammed, Mr. Alyami, it's your turn now, and then we'll go for discussion. Take 5 to 7 minutes. Tell us something about yourself in 30 seconds, and please get started.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadiq. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Muhammad Alyami. I'm the Director of the Development Effectiveness Department at the Islamic Corporation for the Development of Private Sector. It's the private sector arm of the Islamic Development Bank. I have been with the ICD for the last 6 years, and mainly what we are doing is actually the evaluation of the impact of ICD interventions on the member countries where we operate, 55 member countries. So I have PhD in evaluation, and that's really helped me a lot in doing my job. I was thinking I think it's always hard to be the last one, because you're watching the time, you're saying, how can I bring what the previous panel is saying in a good way? So I was thinking of a general statement actually to start with, which is one of the major challenge of achieving SDGs is actually the access to finance. Not the finance itself, despite the fact that the financial gap is huge, but the finance is there somehow, but the access to finance is the challenge. And from that, there was the call for, the financial inclusion to solve the problem and to close this gap. And to do a proper financial inclusion, you need innovations. So I think this loop is really bring us back to the subject of this session, which is mainly the innovation, be it in science and technology or any other field. Innovation is the key to increase the financial inclusion coverage. We are talking about bringing technology to finance, as Dr. Sachin said, and I think that's the fintech. At ICT level, we are really concerned about the SMEs, but also we think that in order to support SMEs, we really would like to think about one stage before, which is maybe the startups. And the startups are actually individuals. So we start to think about how can we help those startups in different countries and try to bring them to the, to being, bankable and eligible for finance. And that's through, partnership, which is the SDG number 17. And we started to do that for like 5 years now. We are in the, since 2017. So one of the things that we are talking about is actually to focus on innovation that driven entrepreneurship in emerging and new trends, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning. We are talking about social innovation. And that's really to solve real problem that those startups, not only the startup, actually private sector is facing in terms of, the ecosystem. What we are targeting from SDGs, I think I would just list 3 SDGs. We are talking about SDG number 1, ending poverty, the challenge of ending poverty and how to take the financial inclusion to that level of people under the poverty line. We are talking about SDG 5, about gender equality, and I think in the previous session, UNAID and also Heidi both mentioned, the women and girls, inequality issue. We are trying to really solve that through providing equal opportunity to those startups and SMEs. And actually, we are giving incentives to entrepreneurs who are really female and girls. We are talking about focusing on decent work and inclusive economic growth, which is the SDG 8, and also the innovation to impact the digital transformation, utilizing big data, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and that will fall under SDG 9. So how we are doing this for the startups, we have what we call the artificial startup weekends that we conducted in 2018. Recently, we started a new program, which is the financial FinLit. We call it FinLit. It's the financial literacy program. We are just conducting a boot camp to increase the awareness of how to, wisely save money and use money and grow your business. We're talking about hackathons. We're talking about social innovation events. And I'm just to put this in context, I'm talking about a practical example here. I know the other panels we're talking about, globally and internationally, but I'm trying to bring this to a practical example that might help, the discussion towards the end. So one of the points that we are talking about is ICD member countries like 50% of the member countries are actually fragile states based on the OECD definition. That's a big challenge, but we still were able to produce and operate in those countries. One of the things that help us a lot is really technology. Okay, being able to reach those crisis, regions without being there physically, and communicate with clients and doing, even the financial procedure in terms of approval, disbursement, and collection also. That's really another topic that help us a lot. Africa is the future of the fintech. That people are saying that. So I think I was reading this article a few weeks back about the agriculture in Kenya, I think, and one of the solution for the farmers is really the artificial intelligence. So where is the rain will come short this year. The artificial intelligence system will read that, and actually the government will send money to your mobile phone as a farmer to secure water for the next few months. That's all through the artificial intelligence. So again, it's all about, from my point of view, it's all about really financial inclusion through fintech. And governance, again, is crucial. That's for now, and I have maybe a bit more to say if you have regarding a specific example of the one of our projects in Yemen and Nigeria, Burkina Faso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed Al-Yarmi. I think we have between 10 and 15 minutes, and questions. It'll be between the panelists. I'll let you start, and anybody can raise a question and ask anybody in the panel. I'm not sure if the participants will get a chance for that. Yes, Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Sadiq. I would very much like to pose this question of how do we operationalize? And I think Jitender's point in yesterday's meeting was very appropriate, that the policy briefs are fine, but how do we find out the modalities of going forward? And I would like to pose that question in context of the technology facilitation mechanism, TFM, that has been placed by the United Nations for taking forward technology to the countries that are intending to achieve sustainable development goals. So how do we operationalize it? And at this stage, a lot of global discussions are on in terms of its operationalization. Germany has taken lead in terms of supporting the technology bank. There are other initiatives. So I would very much like to pose this to the panel, and would expect
anybody can. You
Emma,
mentioned Germany, and Imi raises her hand, and so I think we can listen to her.
Well, Germany has changed its science policy quite a lot, and it has within the EU as well guided research funding very much to applied science. Yeah, and it has also promoted interdisciplinary approaches, but very unequally, in a very patchy way, I would say. And recently, I was surprised to hear at least that while sustainable development as such is not mainstreamed, I wouldn't say it's mainstreamed in a positive way yet in science policy and in economic policy, but I think climate neutrality has made big progress. And I think also in dealing with climate neutrality, so inclusion aspects have also become very important. So I think in that area, there might be some advance, but at the same time, I see science policy as still being very much focused on improving national competitiveness, or in the case of Europe, European competitiveness. So not in terms of global collaborative science. And I think that the technology mechanism you mean, Sachin, is actually thought of accelerating exchange of scientific advance and technology use. because much of it is, there is always an overlap between economic advantages or economic returns and change which promotes the global common good, like in the case of decarbonization. So, and that balance, I'm not convinced still that it is adequately addressed by German research funding and science policy. So we are working heavily about that in Germany to change that. But I would like to make a comment on this question, which has been posed to us in writing on the Q&A. Can I?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
There, the person who asked the question says, "Isn't it all about growth? And why do you make so many proposals and long lists? And wouldn't it all be solved if we have more economic growth?" I mean, economists who argue for economic growth also make long lists. Yeah, so everybody does that. And at the same time, I would say that many of the problems we are wanting the G20 to deal with are created by not well-shaped growth policies or economic policies. Yeah, growth as such is a problem in itself if it's not inclusive, if it's not environmentally friendly. So, and we know that from many calculations. I mean, the environmental toll on China's amazing growth rates over the last 20 years has been so large, yeah, that they have turned around in that sense. So, and that's what we are talking about. This session is about science and technology. And what we are saying is that investment in science and technology is absolutely crucial for economic well-being. Yeah. So I think there is no simple answer to this.
Your thoughts on this question, Natasha? The one which Dr. Chaturvedi asked?
Yes, about how do we operationalize this going forward.
That's very important.
I think I really, I appreciate his points as well, Dr. Sachin, about the languages, and that's something that we struggle with in the region too, with access to materials in Arabic. But I think the need, again, although, Dr. Sadiq, we have that opportunity to collaborate and students to collaborate with each other, I do think that at the very fundamental basis, we do need to overhaul our curricula and help teachers promote the sciences in ways that are interesting and engaging. At the moment, we are trying to get students who are interested in coding, for example, in computer sciences, but it's really difficult because so many students, their only experience of computer science and of coding is a very negative one taught by very boring instructors. So I think there is also, if we are going to operationalize things, I think we have to start with K-12 education and making it far more engaging for students to go into these in the first place and fun. At the moment, I think Amy talked about the bleed, but you know they're dropping out. They're not enjoying. And I read that there's a lot of dropout in the sciences, in engineering, and all these at the university level. So I think we do need to get our teachers on board and excited.
Yes. Mr. Mohammed, your thoughts on Dr. Charan's question, Dr. Sachin's question?
Well, I think I might take this from a different angle, which is how to make it operationalized. I think by bringing in the private sector engagement to this, you know, even kind of policy level, government level, you know, interventions, bringing the private sector to, you know, test, pilot, you know, accelerate the implementation of some of these policies is a key. You know, private sector is always trying to execute and get and receive the impact and the outcomes, I would say, in a faster manner than public agencies. So bringing in the private sector to this formula will expedite the operationalization of this policies and recommendations.
What about NGOs and not-for-profit organizations, especially when it comes to poor and developing countries? Can they play a role in the implementation and in moving forward?
Well, let me take this because we are in communication with the NGOs, and I would say from my short experience, the NGOs today is not the NGOs 5 years back. It's really even their way of doing business and their way of engagement is really to the highest level now. So definitely they can play a major role. And I think always the NGOs sometimes they received in a very good manner. So they will be a good champion for this operationalization.
Any questions from you, Natasha or Amy? We talked a bit about, I mentioned about evaluation and monitoring. What is that one KPI that you would look for and track if you want to see that what we are talking has got implemented and we are moving in the right direction?
In the G20, you mean? When we evaluate G20 policy making?
No, the implementation so that we try to reduce the digital divide and meet the SDGs and try to help the developing countries.
Well, for me, it is the reorganization of the work streams and having, I think bringing that together around topics and putting the levers not only on directly, immediately economic and financial points. That would be the main point for me. And then I would like Fabrizio Botti later to say whether these proposals might be taken up by the Italian presidency, of course.
Yeah. So what is
Dr. Sadiq?
Yes.
Yeah, and since we are talking about evaluation, I think you were trying to get a quick answer by saying what's the one KPI to measure. I think for such a large scale policies, we need to have a comprehensive evaluation framework, literally, to get things done, because the outcomes, achieving the outputs and the outcomes is not enough unless we achieve the impact that we are looking for. I mean, I wouldn't call it waste of time, but it's really waste of opportunities. So a comprehensive evaluation framework is a must. And I really would like to see that in the G20 level.
I agree, but I just said that what of those KPIs, what would be the most important for you to track? That's what I meant. If there's one thing you'd like to, yeah, okay, Dr. Sachin.
Many.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Sadiq. I would suggest very much that the evaluation part depends on the national priorities and national development deficits that are there. As I mentioned, for many countries in the South, the idea of access to technology, the idea that the technology would bring in form of equity is important. So for instance, if in the health pandemic, vaccine is an issue, and as we are seeing the COVAX to bring in, how much access they would have, what are the mechanisms for its distribution, and even we know very well in our Asian region, countries are grappling even for polio vaccine. So there are issues related to access to polio vaccine, access to meningitis and other dimensions, even leishmaniasis. So these are some of the issues where countries are grappling with the major question. Natasha very rightly mentioned about infrastructure, with Dr. Sadiq, you also emphasized on in terms of information technology. So there again, access comes as an issue. So within education, within infrastructure, within other dimensions of technology, access is an issue. And the same then goes to the equity part of it. So it is, if it is available, at what cost it is available? Is it just that the elites are able to afford it, or is it available to everyone? So then the equity question comes in. And then we have to think of innovations that are inclusive in nature. They bring in society together. And then society is able to respond to the governance part that you also emphasized. So I think the impact assessment and evaluation would depend on the level at which a country has arrived with its development parameters.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. Amy, we have 1 minute, and so we'll take your comment and close, because it says that you would like to answer this question. Oh, you answered this already. Yeah. Yes, sorry. We just have less than a minute if anybody wants to make a final comment. For me, it has been very beneficial because I think I'll be thinking about this for some time and I might make some suggestions too. But let's see if we can keep in touch. We have Jitendra as our focal point. Do look at the video I sent to you. And I think it's time we started talking about implementation, the challenges, the obstacles moving forward. We've been talking is a good thing. We have to start with that, but we would like to also see something get done. And if anybody has a last comment, we have a few seconds, we can do that or we can close.
Dr. Sadiq, I would just take this minute to re-emphasize the point that I was making with the pilot project that has been launched by Japan and the EU. EU is supporting Serbia and the UN offices, the UNESCO is supporting Ghana, World Bank is supporting India, and then a couple of other African countries. Ethiopia is part of the project. So I think, as you rightly said, the concretization of STI for SDG is already happening with 5 countries, and with leadership from the Saudi presidency, we can continue this in the next round as the Italian presidency would take over. So I think the G20 is also facilitating specific projects that are there. As from German presidency, we got the Africa Compact, and that is still moving forward.
Any of you also on Yes 20? Because some names were familiar. You were there, Imi, I think, in Yes 22? Oh no, that was another Imi? Okay. Yeah, they also have been thinking on the same lines, and you may want to read their reports. They did a very nice comprehensive survey, and they got lots of feedback in all these issues of infrastructure, AI, COVID, etc. I think we have to close. Thank you all for your participation. It was really wonderful, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq, and thank you all the panel members for that extremely educative discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq. Thank you very much.
The twin themes laid out by Dr. Sami and Dr. Medora at the beginning of this webinar have been woven into a distinct strand, which makes for fascinating listening and also raises issues that need to be taken forward. For that view of what the future holds, I would like to welcome Fabrizio Botti, who is a senior fellow at the IAI, to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Jitendra. Thank you very much. Let me first thank the T20 Saudi Arabia Secretariat, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, and President Medora of CIGI for the invitation and the opportunity to provide an Italian perspective on all these issues that have been raised during this final webinar of the Task Force 7. It is a pleasure for me to be here, considering the importance that the Istituto Affari Internazionali, the Institute of International Affairs, the organization that I'm representing, attached to all these inputs that are stemming from the entire T20 process conducted successfully by our Saudi friends, despite the current turbulent circumstances. The Institute of International Affairs, we co-chair the next T20 2021, being aware of the role Italy we have in leading multilateral efforts to emerge from the global pandemic. Key topics, recommendations that are arising from the task force activity this year in 2020 are guiding the organization of the next T20 in Italy, with a final aim that is to promote an inclusive, fair, and sustainable recovery. As discussed today, and in the very valuable contribution of the Task Force 7, the spread of the coronavirus is having a profound impact on sustainable development efforts, hitting hard the most vulnerable groups, such as women, children, the elderly, migrants, and informal workers. In particular, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states, and countries in fragile situations are likely to bear the biggest burden, as they suffer from weak health system, limited social protection coverage, vulnerability to shock in general, and dependence on international trade. As the 2020 Sustainable Development Report has highlighted, COVID-19 is likely to affect multiple SDGs, including health, education, job losses, gender equality, and so on and so forth. But while it is urgent to undertake effective global initiatives to counter this immediate emergency, it is also essential that all the responses are in line with the broader interlinked targets that are in the UN 3030 agenda. Nonetheless, so far it seems that most of the measures taken to deal with the crisis at the national level make little or no reference to the SDGs as a guiding policy framework. Managing the health crisis while ensuring coherence with the SDGs requires both national and multilateral action. And at the international level, it will be pivotal to reinforce international cooperation on public health, promote trust in multilateralism, and avoid donors reducing their level of official development assistance for the most fragile states. According to a recent speech of the G20 Sherpa and diplomatic advisor of the Italian Prime Minister, Ambassador Benassi, during a webinar we hosted last week, the 2021 agenda of the G20 will build on 3 Ps: people, planet, and prosperity. And in this framework, international commitments to the Paris Agreement and the SDG are considered by the government urgent as the cost of inaction is increasing. In this spirit, the next presidency is ready to consider, amongst many other initiatives, a further enlargement of the G20 debt service suspension initiative towards the low-income countries. And it believes that financing for development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda are vital to promote a sustainable future beyond COVID-19. And that the G20 should work to guarantee a universal and equitable access to vaccines to everybody. The common challenges faced by the global community are huge, and the next Italian G20 presidency efforts have to build on international cooperation and engagement of the civil society. The T20 in this respect is vital as an ideas bank and research-based recommendation provider. The definition of our common future relies on our capacity to work together and contribute to the design of an inclusive, sustainable, and new normality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for what promises to be a really interesting year for the Italian presidency. We are now getting ready to wrap up this webinar, and I hand over to Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, Chair T20 and Vice President and Head of Research at CAPSAT, for the closing remarks. It has been an honor and a privilege to be part of this journey of T20 Saudi Arabia, and I thank Dr. Fahad and the T20 Secretariat for bestowing upon me this opportunity. Dr. Fahad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jitendra. It's both, I think, happy moments to celebrate the end of a very successful process, as well as to see the result of the policy briefs that were presented today. The work that has been done under this task force is very, I think, relevant to many countries, members of the G20, as well as countries that are outside the G20 countries. And I'm happy to see that many of our policy briefs have been authored by non-G20 countries, which I think Saudi Arabia, T20, under its vision of striving for a future of prosperity, sustainability, and inclusion, is taking that into action. So we have around 40 countries participating in these policy briefs, 10 policy briefs, and more than 50 authors contributing to them. It's a quite challenging year last year. I mean, we started as what looked like a challenging year back in December and January. But what we what was challenging at that time was, I think, nothing compared what we embarked on in March. And across all the task forces, I attended all the webinars for the previous 6 task forces and this task force, and will attend the next. I would say we're very proud of the T20 community and how they cope up with the COVID-19 circumstances. We have adjusted our priorities. We have adjusted our policy recommendations quickly within a very short period of time. And this is reflected by the appetite of the policymakers to accept many of the recommendations that we highlight. If you look at, for example, the T20 statement that was submitted to the G20 before the extraordinary leader meetings in end of January, we made a proposal of around 8 or 9 recommendations. 80% of these recommendations were adopted in their final statement. So I think the appetite now is more than any time ever before. And the role of the T20 will be definitely considered because of the greater level of uncertainty. We are, as we realized the COVID-19 pandemic, our inspiration across all the task forces is to enhance the capacity of the global health care system to ensure resilience and preparedness to prevent and mitigate pandemics. And this is reflected on many of the policy briefs that were developed under this task force. And some of the recommendations that were highlighted under this task force include establishing the SDG as principles of coordination, redesign the financial system to support and magnify the impact of the SDGs, and adopt a holistic approach to the implementation of the SDGs, including the integration of common social values and shared faith-based principles. These are some of the recommendations that I picked from the discussion today, as well as from reading the policy briefs, which are now available in our website. And they will be part of our T20 communique that will be released during the summit, or the final 2 days of the summit in October 31st and November 1st. I'm glad and honored to have the Italian representative participate in all our T20 summit webinars. And this is to ensure that there is a continuity in the process. And we heard today that the pillars of the T20 or the G20 Italy will be the planet, the people, and the prosperity. And I think this also reflects the priorities as well as in Saudi Arabia. So I'm sure there will be a continuity in the process, and the role of the Troika will be critical in ensuring that. And I encourage everybody to participate continuously on the T20 summit season here in Saudi Arabia. This is the 7th webinar, but we will still have until the end of the month. We have about 4 other webinars, and we have a 2-day finale, if you wish, for the summit. And then continue to participate in the T20 Italy. I would like to take this opportunity to say, on behalf of the T20 Secretariat, I'd like to thank our lead co-chair, Dr. Sami Suwailem, as well as our colleague, Jitendra, for their leadership in this task force, their continuous work on getting us together. And definitely a special thank to our co-chairs, who without their contribution, we wouldn't see the level of the quality of the policy briefs that is attracting the attention to the SDG and the cooperation or development cooperation issues, which is the main priority for this task force. I would also like to thank the 53 authors for their kind contribution to the task force, as well as to our colleagues in CIGI for their co-hosting of the webinar today. And last but not least, we have two group of people that I think are critically important to the work of the T20. First is our team behind the scene, who's always making sure that our connection is getting there. You getting the right information for our webinars, managing the registration and so on. So a special thank for them, as well as our co-leading institutions, CAPS HARC and KF CRIS, for without their support on the logistics side as well as on the financial side, we wouldn't have had all this successful year. And I think on top of these two organizations, Mr. Adam Seminsky and Dr. Saud Sarhan are dedicated to the contribution of the T20 or the work of the T20. With that, I would conclude, and I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday in our webinar for Task Force 8, the International Financial Architecture, which will take place at the same time on October 15th, and that's this Thursday. With that, I think that's a conclusion of today, and I wish you a beautiful and happy evening, and we'll see you soon, inshallah. Thank you.